At my son's birthday, my daughter-in-law mocked my suit in front of everyone. I decided to teach her a lesson she'll never forget. When my daughter-in-law looked me up and down at my own son's birthday party and said those words that would change everything forever, I smiled politely, nodded, and quietly excused myself to the bathroom. But what she didn't know was that I had just made a decision that would turn her perfect little world completely upside down. By the end of that week, I had spent $50,000 on a single suit. And trust me, that was just the beginning of my plan. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The cashmere scarf felt heavier around my neck as I walked through the mahogany doors of Bergdorf Goodman that Tuesday morning. Not because of the weight of the fabric, but because of the weight of what I was about to do. 3 days had passed since Rebecca's comment at David's birthday dinner, and those 72 hours had given me plenty of time to think, plenty of time to plan, plenty of time to remember exactly who I was before I became the invisible father-in-law who apparently dressed like he shopped at discount stores. Let me take you back to Saturday evening, because you need to understand how we got here. David's 35th birthday party at their Tribeca penthouse, the same penthouse I had helped them secure with a rather substantial down payment 2 years earlier, though that detail seemed to have been conveniently forgotten by everyone except my accountant. I had arrived precisely at 7, wearing what I considered my finest navy suit, hand-tailored by my father's tailor 40 years ago, maintained with the kind of care that only comes from understanding true quality. Rebecca answered the door in what I estimated to be about $8,000 worth of designer everything. Her smile was practiced, perfect, the kind that never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me. "Richard, you made it," she said, her gaze already scanning my appearance with the efficiency of a customs agent. Come in, come in. David's just finishing up a call with Tokyo." I handed her the gift I had selected, a first-edition biography of Winston Churchill that had cost more than most people spend on their monthly car payment. She accepted it with the same enthusiasm one might show for a parking ticket. "How thoughtful," she murmured, setting it aside on the entry table where it would undoubtedly be forgotten until their housekeeper eventually filed it away somewhere. The apartment buzzed with conversation in 3 languages, filled with David's colleagues from the investment firm and Rebecca's friends from whatever circles she traveled in these days. Art dealers, I gathered, and people who used words like curated to describe their breakfast choices. I recognized perhaps 6 faces from previous gatherings, all of whom offered polite nods before returning to discussions about market volatility and summer houses in the Hamptons. I found myself gravitating toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Hudson River, nursing a glass of what I suspected was a very expensive scotch. The city sparkled below us like scattered diamonds on black velvet, each light representing lives being lived, dreams being pursued, battles being fought. From up here, it all looked so manageable, so organized. Nothing like the chaos that was about to unfold in this very room. "Dad, there you are." David appeared at my elbow, his smile genuine in a way that reminded me of the boy who used to build model airplanes in my garage every Saturday morning. "I was just telling the Hendersons about your trip to Scotland last month. They're thinking of doing the same tour." We chatted easily about single malt distilleries and highland landscapes, the kind of conversation that comes naturally between father and son when external pressures aren't dictating the dynamic. David had inherited my appreciation for craftsmanship, though his expressed itself through financial instruments rather than the construction projects that had built my fortune. Different tools, same attention to detail. "Your father has such interesting stories," Rebecca interjected, appearing beside us with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to inserting herself into conversations. "Though I have to say, Richard, that suit really is something." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. David's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a tightening around his eyes that suggested he sensed danger but couldn't yet identify its source. I continued to smile, my hand steady around my glass, giving no indication that anything had changed. "It belonged to my father," I said evenly. "Savile Row, 1978. They don't make them quite like this anymore." Rebecca's laugh was like crystal breaking on marble. "Oh, I can tell. It has such a vintage feel to it, very authentic." She paused, her head tilting slightly as if she were examining a museum piece. It's just so refreshing to see someone who doesn't feel the need to keep up with current fashion trends. There's something almost brave about wearing clothes that are so obviously from another era. The conversations around us seemed to dim, as if the universe itself was holding its breath to see how this moment would resolve. I could feel eyes turning in our direction, could sense the collective intake of breath that precedes either violence or revelation. David's face had gone pale, his mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but no words emerging. "You know," Rebecca continued, warming to her theme like a pianist finding her rhythm, "I was just telling Cynthia how much I admire people who prioritize comfort over appearance. It takes real confidence to walk into a room like this wearing something that probably costs less than most people spend on their shoes." She gestured around the room with her wine glass, encompassing the gathered crowd of Manhattan's financial elite. "I mean, that suit probably has such sentimental value that the actual monetary worth becomes completely irrelevant." The silence that followed was the kind that makes elevator rides uncomfortable, the kind that makes you suddenly aware of your own heartbeat. I took a slow sip of my scotch, savoring the burn as it traveled down my throat, using those few seconds to make a decision that would change everything. "You're absolutely right, Rebecca," I said finally, my voice carrying the same conversational tone one might use to comment on the weather. "Sentimental value is indeed priceless, though I should probably mention that this particular suit was hand-cut by Henry Poole and Company. The fabric is a Loro Piana Super 180s wool that retails for about $800 per yard. The construction alone took their master tailor 6 weeks, and the final bill, if memory serves, was somewhere in the neighborhood of $12,000. In 1978 money, of course. Rebecca's wine glass had stopped halfway to her lips, frozen in mid-gesture, like a photograph capturing the exact moment when confidence transforms into confusion. The color in her cheeks had shifted from the warm pink of wine and social triumph to something closer to the gray of old newspaper. "But you're absolutely right about prioritizing comfort over appearance," I continued, my smile never wavering. "That's precisely why I've never felt the need to announce the provenance of my clothing to rooms full of strangers. I've always found that true quality speaks for itself to those who understand such things." David had found his voice, though it came out slightly strangled. "Dad, Rebecca didn't mean—" "Oh, but she did," I interrupted gently, placing a hand on my son's shoulder with the kind of paternal affection that had guided him through 35 years of life. "And she was absolutely correct. This suit is from another era, an era when craftsmanship mattered more than brand recognition, when quality was built to last generations rather than seasons. It's refreshing to meet someone who appreciates that kind of authenticity." The crowd around us had grown larger, drawn by the magnetic pull of social tension like moths to flame. I could see phones being discreetly positioned, could feel the weight of attention that comes when a room full of people senses they're witnessing something that will be discussed at dinner parties for months to come. Rebecca had recovered enough to attempt a strategic retreat. "Richard, I think there might have been a misunderstanding. I was simply complimenting my fashion choices," I finished for her, "and I appreciate it more than you know. In fact, your comments have inspired me to do something I've been considering for quite some time." I reached into my jacket pocket and withdrew my phone, the same phone that contained the contact information for some of the most exclusive tailors, jewelers, and luxury goods dealers in 3 countries. The same phone that could, with a few carefully placed calls, transform this evening from a minor social embarrassment into something far more significant. "I think it's time I updated my wardrobe," I announced to the room, my thumb already scrolling through contacts. After all, if my current style is making such an impression, imagine what might happen if I really made an effort. The smile that spread across my face was the same one I had worn 40 years earlier when I closed my first $1 million deal. The same one that had appeared when I realized my competitors had underestimated both my resources and my resolve. It was the smile of a man who had just been given the perfect excuse to do something he had been wanting to do anyway. Rebecca's face had gone completely white now, her earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist in sunlight. She understood, perhaps better than anyone else in that room, that she had just made a very expensive mistake. What she didn't understand yet was exactly how expensive it was going to be. David, I said, turning to my son with the kind of paternal warmth that had tucked him into bed thousands of nights, would you mind if we continued this conversation over lunch tomorrow? I have some shopping to do, and I'd love your input on a few purchases I'm considering. As I walked toward the door, the crowd parting before me like water before the bow of a ship, I could feel the weight of their stares, the electricity of whispered conversations already beginning. Behind me, Rebecca's voice rose in what sounded like the beginning of damage control, but I was no longer listening. I had more important things to think about, like how exactly one goes about spending $50,000 on a single suit, and what message that purchase was going to send to a daughter-in-law who had just learned that sometimes the most dangerous opponents are the ones who smile politely while you're insulting them. The elevator doors closed behind me with a soft whisper, and I found myself alone with my reflection in the polished brass. The man looking back at me was the same man who had walked into that apartment 2 hours earlier, wearing the same supposedly outdated suit, carrying the same quiet dignity that had built an empire from nothing. But something fundamental had changed in those 2 hours, something that would make the next few days very interesting indeed. The concierge at the St. Regis recognized me immediately when I walked through the lobby at 8:30 the next morning. "Good morning, Mr. Hartwell. The usual breakfast in the Oak Room?" "Not today, Thomas." I handed him a business card that had been gathering dust in my wallet for the better part of a decade. "I need you to call this number and tell them Richard Hartwell would like to schedule an appointment. This morning, if possible." Thomas glanced at the card and his eyebrows rose slightly. Alessandro Gherardi, Master Tailor. The kind of name that meant nothing to most people but everything to those who understood that true luxury wasn't about logos or marketing campaigns. It was about the difference between wearing clothes and being dressed by an artist. "Shall I mention that it's urgent, sir? Tell them it's personal." I smiled, the same smile that had been brewing since I left Rebecca's performance the night before. "And Thomas? Also call Cartier, Patek Philippe, and Berluti. Same message for all of them." An hour later, I found myself in a private showroom that most people would never know existed, tucked away on the 3rd floor of a nondescript building in the Diamond District. Alessandro Gherardi was exactly what you'd expect from a man who had dressed 3 generations of European royalty and American industrialists. Silver-haired, precise in his movements, with eyes that could measure a man's character as accurately as his chest size. "Mr. Hartwell," he said, extending a hand that felt like leather, worn smooth by decades of handling the world's finest fabrics. "It has been too long. Your father was one of my favorite clients, you know. Such appreciation for true craftsmanship. That's precisely why I'm here, Alessandro. I need something special, something that will make a very specific statement." He nodded slowly, understanding passing between us without the need for detailed explanation. Men like Alessandro didn't build their reputations by asking unnecessary questions. They built them by delivering exactly what their clients needed, sometimes before the clients themselves fully understood what that was. "I have been saving something," he said, leading me deeper into the showroom where bolts of fabric lined the walls like books in a library. A cloth that arrived last month from Scotland, vicuña and silk blend, woven specifically for one client who unfortunately passed before taking delivery. He pulled out a bolt of fabric that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, dark gray with threads of silver running through it like veins of precious metal. When he draped it across his arm, it moved like liquid mercury, catching the light at angles that seemed to defy physics. This is perhaps the rarest fabric I've ever worked with," Alessandro continued, his voice taking on the reverence usually reserved for religious ceremonies. "The vicuña alone costs more per yard than most people earn in a month. The silk comes from a single farm in China that produces perhaps 50 yards per year. Together, they create something that exists nowhere else in the world." I ran my fingers across the material, feeling the impossible softness that only came from animals that lived in conditions so harsh that their survival depended on producing the finest natural insulation on Earth. This wasn't just fabric. This was a statement written in a language that Rebecca would understand perfectly. "How much?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be irrelevant to my decision. "For the cloth alone, 18,000. The construction, given the complexity of working with vicuña, would be another 25. The details, hand-stitched buttonholes, mother-of-pearl buttons custom carved to match the suit's character, horn from water buffalo, another 5,000. Then there are the accessories that would be necessary to complete such a piece. He moved to another section of the showroom, withdrawing items from locked cases like a curator handling museum pieces. A tie woven from silk that had been dyed using techniques that dated back to the Ming Dynasty. Cufflinks that contained diamonds so perfectly cut they seemed to generate their own light. A pocket watch that had been assembled by hand in Switzerland by craftsmen whose waiting list was measured in years rather than months. Altogether, Alessandro said, his calculator clicking softly as he tallied figures that would make most people dizzy. $53,400. This assumes you want everything completed to the highest possible standard. I thought about Rebecca's laugh, crystalline and cutting. I thought about the way she had looked at my father's suit, the dismissive gesture that had reduced 40 years of memories to something quaint and outdated. I thought about the faces of her friends, already composing the stories they would tell about the old man in the vintage clothing who clearly didn't understand how the world worked anymore. When can it be ready? Alessandro's smile was the expression of an artist who had just been given permission to create a masterpiece. For a project of this importance, 1 week. Though I should warn you, Mr. Hartwell, a suit like this will change how people see you. Are you prepared for that level of attention? I thought about the last time I had worn something that made people stop and stare. It had been at a charity auction 15 years earlier, when I'd bid $200,000 for a painting that everyone else in the room had assumed was beyond my reach. The silence that had followed my winning bid had been absolute, the kind of quiet that comes when people suddenly realize they've been operating under incorrect assumptions. Alessandro, I said, extending my hand to seal an agreement that would transform more than just my appearance. I'm counting on it. The measurements took an hour, Alessandro's hands moving with the precision of a surgeon as he recorded dimensions that would be translated into something approaching wearable art. Every few minutes, he would mutter something in Italian, shaking his head in what I assumed was either admiration for the project or concern for my sanity. There is one more thing, he said as we concluded the fitting process. A suit like this, it demands a certain confidence to wear properly. It will announce your presence before you speak a word. Every person in every room will know immediately that they are looking at something extraordinary. That can be intimidating, even for men who are accustomed to being noticed. I thought about the boardrooms where I had negotiated deals that moved millions of dollars with nothing more than a handshake. I thought about the construction sites where I had earned the respect of men who judged character by actions rather than words. I thought about the long nights when I had built something from nothing while other men slept, driven by a vision that no one else could see clearly. I think I can handle it, I said. From Alessandro's showroom, I walked 6 blocks to a jewelry store that existed in a different universe from the places most people bought their accessories. No display windows, no signs advertising sales or special promotions. Just a discreet brass plaque beside a door that looked like it might lead to someone's private residence. Inside, Marcus Goldstein examined the list I had prepared with the same intensity a general might use to study battle plans. Diamond cufflinks that would catch light from across a crowded room. A watch that cost more than most people's cars and would keep time accurately for the next century. A tie clip that had been crafted by hand in Italy, using techniques that hadn't changed since the Renaissance. Mr. Hartwell, Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years in the luxury goods business. This is quite an extensive list. May I ask what prompted such a comprehensive wardrobe upgrade? I thought about how to answer that question. I could have mentioned Rebecca's comments, the way she had tried to diminish me in front of her friends, the assumption that age had somehow made me irrelevant. But that would have missed the deeper truth of what was happening here. Someone recently reminded me that first impressions matter, I said finally. I decided it was time to make sure mine was unforgettable. Marcus nodded with the understanding that comes from decades of helping wealthy men make statements through their possessions. He had probably outfitted hedge fund managers trying to impress potential investors, tech entrepreneurs attempting to convince venture capitalists of their vision, politicians preparing for debates that would define their careers. But there was something different about this transaction, something that went beyond simple status signaling. This was about respect, about reminding people that dismissing someone based on appearances was a luxury that could prove very expensive. The final stop was a shoe store that existed in the kind of building that most people walked past without noticing, assuming it housed accountants or lawyers or other professionals who dealt in paperwork rather than craftsmanship. Inside, however, was a workshop that produced footwear for men who understood that everything from the ground up contributed to the impression they made on the world. Giovanni Rossi examined my feet with the intensity of a doctor conducting a physical examination, his hands mapping contours and pressure points that would inform the construction of shoes designed to last decades rather than seasons. The leather he selected came from cattle, raised in conditions so specific that they produced hides with a grain structure that couldn't be replicated artificially. These will require 6 weeks, he explained, his English heavily accented but perfectly clear. But when they are complete, you will understand why kings once waited months for shoes from my family's workshop. By the time I returned to my apartment that evening, word of my shopping expedition had somehow preceded me. David was waiting in my lobby, his expression a mixture of concern and curiosity that reminded me of the way he used to look when he thought he might be in trouble but wasn't entirely sure what he had done wrong. "Dad, we need to talk," he said as we rode the elevator to my floor. She's been calling me all day. She thinks you're planning something." I unlocked my apartment door and gestured for him to follow me inside. The space reflected 40 years of careful acquisition, each piece of furniture and art chosen not for its immediate impact, but for its ability to reward closer examination. This was what happened when someone with resources took time to develop taste rather than simply following trends. "Your wife is a perceptive woman," I said, pouring 2 glasses of scotch from a bottle that had been aging longer than David had been alive, though I suspect her perception might be somewhat colored by guilt at the moment. David accepted the glass but didn't drink, his eyes scanning my face for clues about what was coming next. "Dad, about last night, Rebecca feels terrible about what she said. She didn't mean to imply that your suit was cheap? Outdated? Inappropriate for polite company?" I settled into my favorite chair, the leather worn smooth by decades of evening conversations and quiet contemplation. "David, your wife said exactly what she meant to say. The question now is what we're going to do about it." The silence stretched between us like a bridge neither of us was quite ready to cross. David set his untouched scotch on the side table, his movements careful and deliberate, the way he used to handle my tools when he was 7 years old and desperate to help with weekend projects, but terrified of breaking something valuable. "What exactly are you planning, Dad?" His voice carried that particular tension that comes from knowing you're about to receive information that will complicate your life significantly. "Because Rebecca spent the entire day convinced that you're going to do something dramatic. And honestly, after seeing you at Alessandro's today, I'm starting to think she might be right." I took a slow sip of my scotch, savoring the way it burned just enough to remind you it was real. "How did you know about Alessandro's?" "Marcus Goldstein called me." David's admission came with the sheepish expression of a man who'd been caught in minor espionage. He wanted to verify that you were actually planning to spend $50,000 on jewelry and accessories. Apparently, transactions of that size require additional verification procedures even for established clients. The fact that Marcus had called my son rather than me directly told me everything I needed to know about how this news was traveling through the small, interconnected world of Manhattan's luxury goods dealers. By tomorrow morning, everyone who mattered in those circles would know that Richard Hartwell was making purchases that suggested either a significant life change or the beginning of what polite society might call an episode. "And what did you tell him?" I asked, genuinely curious about how David had handled the situation. "I told him to process the transaction." David's answer surprised me with its decisiveness. "But Dad, I need to understand what's happening here. This isn't just about a suit, is it? This is about Rebecca, about what she said, about the way she's been treating you." There it was. The conversation we'd been dancing around for months, maybe years. The elephant in the room that had grown so large, it was starting to crush the furniture. David wasn't stupid, and he wasn't blind. He'd seen the way his wife looked at me, heard the subtle condescension in her voice, witnessed the thousand small cuts that accumulated over time into something that resembled active hostility. Your wife has made it clear that she finds my presence in your lives somewhat embarrassing, I said, choosing my words with the same care I'd once used to negotiate contracts worth millions of dollars. She's not entirely wrong. I'm from a different generation, with different values and different ways of expressing myself. The question is whether I'm going to accept her assessment or provide her with some additional context. David leaned forward, his hands clasped together in a gesture that took me back 30 years to parent-teacher conferences where we discussed his potential and his challenges with equal measure. Dad, Rebecca doesn't understand you. She grew up in a world where everything was about appearances, where status was measured by brands and labels, and how much money you could demonstrate you were spending. She doesn't know about the company you built, about the deals you closed, about the respect you earned from people who actually mattered. Chai, and whose fault is that? The question came out sharper than I'd intended, carrying an edge that made David flinch slightly. David, you've been married to this woman for 3 years. In that time, how many stories have you told her about what I actually accomplished? How many times have you explained that the man she sees as some quaint relic from the past actually built the foundation that made her current lifestyle possible? The color drained from David's face as the implications of my question settled over him. He understood now that this wasn't just about Rebecca's comment at the party. This was about years of being treated like a harmless old man whose presence was tolerated rather than valued, whose contributions were acknowledged with polite nods rather than genuine respect. I thought she knew, he said quietly, but we both recognized the lie in those words. I mean, she knows you're successful. She knows you helped us with the down payment for the apartment. She knows you've done well for yourself. She knows I have money, I corrected. That's very different from understanding how I earned it or what it cost me to accumulate it. To Rebecca, I'm simply another wealthy old man who writes checks when asked and otherwise stays out of the way. The problem is, David, that's apparently how you see me too. The accusation hung between us like smoke from a gun barrel, impossible to ignore and dangerous to touch. David's mouth opened as if to protest, but no words emerged because we both knew I was right. Somewhere along the way, in his eagerness to build a life that impressed his wife and her social circle, he'd allowed me to become a peripheral figure in my own son's story. That's not true, Dad. But his voice lacked conviction, and his eyes wouldn't quite meet mine. You know how much you mean to me, how much I respect what you've accomplished. Do I? I stood up and walked to the window that looked out over Central Park, where the last light of day was fading into the kind of purple twilight that made the city look like a painting. David, when was the last time you asked me for advice about something that actually mattered? When was the last time you called me because you wanted to talk, rather than because Rebecca thought we should have dinner, or because some social obligation required my presence? The silence that followed was answer enough. I could see his reflection in the window glass, could watch him wrestling with the realization that our relationship had become as formal and scheduled as a business meeting. We met for lunch on birthdays and holidays, exchanged pleasantries about work and weather, maintained the appearance of closeness without any of the substance. This suit, I continued, my voice carrying the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. This $50,000 statement that's got Rebecca so worried, it's not really about her at all. It's about reminding everyone, including you, that I'm still here. That I'm still the same man who built something significant while other people were sleeping, who earned respect through actions rather than inherited it through circumstances. I turned back to face him, noting how small he looked in my leather chair, how young despite his 35 years and his expensive suit and his impressive job title. Your wife thinks she embarrassed me at that party. What she actually did was give me permission to stop pretending that her opinion of me matters more than my opinion of myself. David's hands were shaking slightly as he reached for his scotch, finally taking the drink he'd been avoiding since he arrived. Dad, what are you going to do? Because Rebecca is terrified that you're planning some kind of public humiliation, some way of making her look foolish in front of her friends. And what would you do? I asked, settling back into my chair with the satisfaction of a man who'd finally identified the real problem. If you discovered that someone you'd welcomed into your family, someone you'd supported and helped and treated with nothing but kindness, had been systematically undermining your dignity for years, what would you do if you realized that this person saw you as nothing more than a convenient source of financial support and occasional embarrassment? The question wasn't rhetorical, and we both knew it. David understood that I was asking him to choose sides, to decide whether his loyalty belonged to the father who'd raised him or the wife who'd married him. It was an impossible position, the kind that destroys families and creates wounds that never fully heal. But it was also necessary. Because what Rebecca had done at that party, what she'd been doing for months with her subtle comments and dismissive glances, couldn't continue without consequences. Not because my ego demanded satisfaction, but because relationships that aren't built on mutual respect inevitably collapse under their own weight. She's my wife, Dad. David's voice was barely above a whisper, carrying the weight of a man who'd just realized that the life he'd built was more fragile than he'd understood. I can't just abandon her because she made a mistake. I'm not asking you to abandon her, I replied, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. I'm asking you to decide whether you're going to continue enabling behavior that's destructive to our family, or whether you're going to help me teach her that actions have consequences. David finished his scotch in one swallow, wincing slightly at the burn. When he looked up at me, his eyes held the same expression I remembered from his childhood, when he'd broken something valuable and was trying to calculate whether honesty or denial offered the better chance of avoiding punishment. "What kind of consequences are we talking about?" he asked, and I knew that whatever happened next would depend entirely on how I answered that question. I walked to my desk and withdrew the folder I'd been preparing since Alessandro's phone call that afternoon. Inside were photographs of the suit being constructed, detailed specifications of every element that would comprise the finished product, and an itemized bill that read like the GDP of a small nation. But more importantly, it contained a guest list for the charity auction that Rebecca's art dealer friends would be attending next Friday evening. "Your wife believes that clothing is a form of communication," I said, sliding the folder across the table toward David. "She's absolutely right about that. What she failed to consider is that I might have something more interesting to say than she anticipated." David opened the folder and his face went pale as he absorbed the numbers, the photographs, the implications of what I was planning. "Dad, this is insane. You can't spend this kind of money just to prove a point." "Can I?" I smiled with the satisfaction of a man who'd just realized he held all the cards in a game his opponents didn't even know they were playing. "David, I've spent the last 3 years watching your wife treat me like some doddering old fool who doesn't understand how the modern world works. Next Friday evening, at the Metropolitan Museum's annual fundraising gala, I'm going to give her a demonstration of exactly how well I understand the language she's been speaking." The charity auction was Rebecca's element, the kind of event where she could display her knowledge of contemporary art while surrounded by the people whose approval she craved most. It would be attended by gallery owners and collectors, by society photographers and gossip columnists, by everyone who mattered in the insular world where she'd built her identity. It would also be the perfect stage for a lesson in the difference between having money and understanding power. "She'll be wearing that black Chanel dress," David said, his voice distant as he processed the implications of what I was planning. "The one that cost $8,000. She's been talking about it for weeks, about how perfect it will be for the photographs, how it will photograph well with the Monet they're auctioning." How thoughtful of her to coordinate her outfit with the artwork," I replied, though my tone suggested I found nothing thoughtful about it at all. "I'm sure she'll look lovely in the photographs, though I suspect the real story that evening will be happening elsewhere." David closed the folder and pushed it back across the table, his movements careful and deliberate. "Dad, please, don't do this. Whatever point you're trying to make, there has to be another way. Rebecca made a mistake. She said something thoughtless, but destroying her in public isn't going to fix our family. Our family's already broken, David." The words came out harder than I'd intended, carrying the weight of 3 years of accumulated disappointment and frustration. "It broke the moment you decided that keeping your wife happy was more important than maintaining your father's dignity. What I'm planning for Friday evening isn't destruction, it's clarification." The grandfather clock in my hallway chimed 9 times, its measured voice marking the passage of another day in what was rapidly becoming the most interesting week I'd experienced in years. Outside my window, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm of ambition and desire, millions of people pursuing their individual versions of success without realizing how quickly circumstances could change. I need to go home, David said, standing with the careful movements of a man who'd just learned that his world was less stable than he'd believed. Rebecca will be waiting, and after today's phone calls, she's going to want a full report on this conversation. Give her my regards, I said, though we both understood that my regards were the last thing Rebecca wanted at the moment. And David? Tell her that I'm looking forward to Friday evening. I have a feeling it's going to be an unforgettable night for everyone involved. After he left, I poured myself another scotch and settled into my chair with the satisfaction of a man who'd finally decided to stop playing defense. For 3 years, I'd absorbed Rebecca's subtle insults and dismissive comments, had allowed her to reduce me to a convenient source of financial support who could be safely ignored when more interesting people were available. That era was ending. And if Rebecca thought my father's 40-year-old suit had made a statement about my understanding of fashion, she was going to find Friday evening's revelation absolutely illuminating. The phone rang at exactly 10 o'clock, Rebecca's number appearing on my caller ID like a declaration of war. I let it ring 4 times before answering, long enough to establish that I wasn't sitting by the phone waiting for her call, short enough to avoid seeming petty. Richard, we need to talk. Her voice carried the kind of controlled tension that suggested she'd been practicing this conversation for hours, refining her approach until she'd found the right balance of authority and conciliation. Good evening, Rebecca. How was your day? The pleasantry seemed to throw her off balance, as if she'd been prepared for hostility but not politeness. Richard, please. David told me about your shopping expedition, about the suit, about whatever you're planning for Friday night. I think there's been a misunderstanding about what happened at the party. Has there? I settled deeper into my chair, enjoying the rare experience of having Rebecca seek my attention rather than merely tolerate it. Please, enlighten me about what I misunderstood. The pause that followed was long enough that I began to wonder if the call had been dropped. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of something that might have been genuine regret, though with Rebecca, it was always difficult to distinguish between authentic emotion and calculated performance. I never meant to insult you or your father's suit. I was trying to be supportive, to acknowledge that you don't feel pressure to keep up with current trends. I thought I was being complimentary. I see. I took a sip of my scotch, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. And when you mentioned that the suit probably cost less than most people spend on shoes, that was also meant as a compliment? Another pause, shorter this time, but heavy with the weight of someone realizing that their carefully constructed narrative was collapsing under examination. I think I expressed myself poorly. Sometimes when I'm nervous at social gatherings, I say things that don't come out the way I intend them. You were nervous? The question carried genuine curiosity. Rebecca, that was your apartment, your party, your friends. What exactly were you nervous about? The answer, when it came, was so quiet I almost didn't hear it. You intimidate me, Richard. You always have. You're so accomplished, so confident, so obviously successful at everything you've ever done. Sometimes I feel like I have to prove that I belong in the same room with you, and that makes me say stupid things. For a moment, just a moment, I felt something that might have been sympathy for the woman who'd spent 3 years treating me like an embarrassing relic. But then I remembered the laughter that had followed her comments, the way her friends had smiled at my expense, the look of smug satisfaction on her face as she'd reduced my father's memory to a punchline for her entertainment. Rebecca, I said, my voice carrying the weight of decisions that couldn't be unmade. If you found me intimidating, you should probably prepare yourself for Friday evening, because intimidating is exactly what I'm planning to be. The line went dead with a click that felt like a period at the end of a very long sentence. I sat in the gathering darkness of my apartment, the scotch warming my chest while the city lights began to twinkle beyond my windows like stars in a manufactured constellation. 3 days until Friday. 3 days until Rebecca learned that some lessons come with price tags that extend far beyond money. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made Manhattan feel like a city where anything was possible. I dressed carefully in one of my remaining vintage suits, this one a charcoal gray that had been crafted in London sometime during the Carter administration. If Rebecca thought Tuesday's navy suit had made a statement, she was welcome to analyze today's selection while I made my final preparations. The first stop was my attorney's office, where Margaret Chen had been handling my legal affairs for the better part of 2 decades. She greeted me with the kind of professional warmth that comes from years of mutual respect and the occasional very interesting challenge. "Richard, I have to say, your call yesterday was intriguing. Estate planning revision isn't usually something that requires emergency scheduling." She gestured toward the leather chair across from her mahogany desk, the same chair where I'd signed documents that had shaped the trajectory of my family's financial future. "Margaret, I need to discuss some adjustments to David's inheritance structure." I settled into the familiar chair, noting how the morning light streaming through her corner office windows made the city look like a vast game board where fortunes were won and lost with each passing hour. Specifically, I want to establish some performance criteria that weren't previously part of our arrangement. Margaret's eyebrows rose with the practiced subtlety of someone who'd spent years hearing wealthy families discuss money as if it were a tool for behavior modification. "What kind of performance criteria are we talking about?" I withdrew a folder from my briefcase, the same methodical preparation that had made me successful in business, now applied to family dynamics with surgical precision. "I want David's access to his trust fund tied to specific relationship benchmarks. Marriage counseling completion, public acknowledgement of family contributions, demonstration of respect for elder family members." "Richard." Margaret's tone carried the gentle warning of someone who'd seen family money used as a weapon before. "Are you certain this is the path you want to take? Once we implement conditions like these, they become very difficult to reverse without significant legal complications." I thought about Rebecca's crystalline laugh, about the way she'd looked at my father's suit like it was a museum piece that had wandered into the wrong century. I thought about David's silence during that moment, his failure to defend either me or the memory of the man who'd taught him everything he knew about quality and craftsmanship. "Barking." "Margaret, my son has forgotten that respect isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn through your choices, your actions, your willingness to stand up for the people who've stood up for you." I slid the documents across her desk with the finality of a chess player making a decisive move. These conditions will help remind him of that lesson. The paperwork took 2 hours to complete, each signature and initial transforming family relationships into legal obligations with measurable outcomes. By the time I left Margaret's office, David's financial future had become contingent on his ability to demonstrate the kind of character I'd tried to instill in him 35 years earlier. My phone buzzed with a text from Alessandro as I walked toward my next appointment. "Mr. Hartwell, the final fitting is complete. The result exceeds even my expectations. When would you like to take delivery?" I typed back with fingers that felt steadier than they had in months. "Tomorrow morning at 10. I want to wear it immediately after pickup." The response came back within minutes. "Of course, though I should warn you again, this suit will change how people perceive you. Are you prepared for that level of transformation?" I smiled at the phone screen, thinking about all the transformations I'd witnessed over 4 decades in business. Companies that had seemed invincible crumbling overnight when they underestimated their competition. Entrepreneurs who'd built empires from nothing because they understood that perception and reality were often the same thing. Families who'd lost everything because they confused politeness with weakness. "Alessandro," I typed back, "I'm counting on transformation. It's exactly what this situation requires." The afternoon was spent at my office, the same corner suite where I'd built my construction empire one contract at a time. My assistant, Carol, had been fielding calls all week from business associates who'd heard rumors about my recent purchases and wanted to understand what Richard Hartwell was planning. The luxury goods community in Manhattan was smaller than most people realized, and news of a $50,000 suit traveled through those circles with the speed of market rumors. "Mr. Hartwell," Carol said, appearing in my doorway with the expression she wore when delivering information that required careful handling. "Marcus Goldstein called again. He wanted to confirm that you'll be attending the museum gala tomorrow evening." Apparently, several of his other clients will be there, and he thought you might appreciate a heads up about the attention your new accessories are likely to generate. I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the Manhattan skyline where cranes and construction sites marked the constant process of destruction and renewal that defined the city's character. Somewhere in that maze of steel and glass, Rebecca was probably planning her own outfit for tomorrow evening, carefully selecting pieces that would photograph well and complement her image as someone who understood sophisticated taste. Carol, please call the Metropolitan Museum's events coordinator. I want to make an additional donation to tomorrow's auction, something significant enough to guarantee my name appears in the program with appropriate recognition. How significant are we talking about? Carol's pen was poised over her notepad, though her expression suggested she was already calculating the impact of whatever number I was about to provide. $250,000. I want it designated for the museum's educational outreach programs, with specific emphasis on teaching young people about the importance of respecting their cultural heritage. Carol's pen stopped moving entirely, her eyes widening as she processed the implications of such a substantial last-minute donation. Mr. Hartwell, that will make you one of the evening's primary benefactors. Your name will be prominently featured in all the evening's materials. Excellent. I turned back to my computer, where spreadsheets displayed the financial empire I'd built through decades of careful planning and strategic thinking. Also, please contact the museum's photography team. I want to ensure they have my biographical information available for any media requests tomorrow evening. The biographical information Carol would provide painted a picture that Rebecca had apparently never bothered to research. 40 years of business success, hundreds of millions in development projects, charitable contributions that had funded libraries and schools across 3 states. A man whose influence extended far beyond the construction industry into areas that shaped how communities grew and prospered. By 5 o'clock, word of my museum donation had spread through the same networks that had been buzzing about my suit purchase. My phone rang with calls from board members I'd known for years, all expressing delight that I was taking such a prominent role in tomorrow's event. None of them seemed surprised that Richard Hartwell was capable of writing checks with that many zeros. Only one person in my life had ever found that capability shocking. David called as I was preparing to leave the office, his voice carrying the strain of someone who'd spent the day fielding questions he couldn't answer. Dad, Rebecca is beside herself. She heard about the museum donation, about the suit being ready tomorrow, about you basically taking over Friday night's event. She's convinced you're planning to humiliate her in front of everyone she's ever worked with. And what do you think, David? I asked, genuinely curious about whether my son understood what was actually happening. Do you think I'm planning to humiliate your wife? The pause that followed was long enough for me to walk from my office to the elevator, the silence stretching across phone lines and years of accumulated disappointment. When David finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been understanding. I think you're planning to remind her who she's been talking to for the past 3 years. And honestly, Dad, after watching how she's treated you, part of me thinks she deserves whatever lesson you're planning to teach. And the other part? I stepped into the elevator, watching the numbers count down toward the lobby where my car was waiting. The other part is terrified that this is going to destroy my marriage and leave me choosing between my father and my wife. His voice cracked slightly on the last words, carrying the weight of a man who'd finally understood that some choices couldn't be avoided indefinitely. The elevator doors opened onto the marble lobby of my building, where the evening rush was beginning to thin as Manhattan prepared for another night of ambition and consequence. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the city transforming itself from business district to entertainment destination, the same streets serving different purposes as circumstances required. David, I said, walking toward the exit where my driver was waiting, your marriage was destroyed the moment you allowed your wife to treat your father with contempt and said nothing to stop it. What's happening tomorrow evening isn't destruction, it's revelation. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made October in New York feel like the center of the universe. I dressed in one of my older suits for the final time, knowing that by afternoon, everything about how I presented myself to the world would be fundamentally different. The man who walked into Alessandro's showroom at 10 o'clock would emerge as someone else entirely. Alessandro greeted me with the satisfaction of an artist unveiling his masterpiece. Mr. Hartwell, I have been in this business for 37 years. I have dressed princes and presidents, industrialists and artists. What I'm about to show you represents the finest work my hands have ever produced. The suit hung in the center of his private fitting room like a work of sculpture, the vicuña and silk blend, seeming to absorb and reflect light simultaneously. The color was deeper than anything I'd ever seen, dark gray with silver threads that created patterns visible only when examined closely. The construction was flawless, every seam and stitch placed with mathematical precision. The fabric alone tells a story, Alessandro explained as he helped me into the jacket. The vicuña comes from animals that live at altitudes where survival requires producing the finest natural fiber on Earth. The silk was woven by artisans whose families have practiced these techniques for centuries. Together, they create something that has never existed before and will never exist again. The fit was perfect in ways that transcended mere measurement. The jacket moved with my body as if it had been grown rather than constructed, the trousers falling with the kind of drape that suggested liquid mercury rather than fabric. When I looked in the three-way mirror, the reflection showed someone I recognized but had never seen before. Now the accessories, Alessandro said, producing items from locked cases with the reverence of a curator handling priceless artifacts. The cufflinks caught light from angles that seemed to defy physics, each diamond perfectly cut and set with precision that required magnification to fully appreciate. The watch was a work of mechanical poetry, its movement visible through a crystal case back that revealed the intricate dance of gears and springs that would continue long after I was gone. The final element was a pocket watch that had been crafted by hand in Switzerland, its face displaying not just time but moon phases and planetary positions. The chain was platinum, each link individually forged and polished to mirror brightness. When Alessandro attached it to my vest, the weight felt substantial without being burdensome, a reminder that true quality announced itself through substance rather than ostentation. "There is one more thing," Alessandro said, withdrawing a final box from his safe. The tie. This silk was dyed using techniques that date to the Ming Dynasty, colors that change subtly with different light sources. During daylight, it appears deep blue. Under artificial light, it shifts to purple with threads of gold. When the ensemble was complete, I stood before the mirror looking at someone who commanded attention without demanding it, who suggested power without threatening anyone, who embodied the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who you were and what you were worth. This wasn't costume or disguise, this was revelation. "How do you feel?" Alessandro asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity about the psychological impact of his creation. "Like myself," I answered, and realized that was exactly the truth. For the first time in 3 years, I feel like myself. The drive from Alessandro's showroom to the Metropolitan Museum took 20 minutes through Central Park, the autumn foliage providing a backdrop that seemed choreographed for the evening ahead. I spent the time reviewing the guest list Carol had obtained, noting which names would recognize the significance of my transformation, and which would simply see an older man in an expensive suit. Rebecca's name appeared on the list as Mrs. David Hartwell, her professional association with several galleries, earning her inclusion in the art world's social hierarchy. She would arrive expecting to network with collectors and dealers, to be photographed beside significant artworks, to solidify her position in circles where reputation was measured by association with cultural importance. She had no idea that tonight's most significant artwork would be the statement I was making about the difference between inherited privilege and earned respect. The museum's great hall was already buzzing with pre-event energy when I arrived, waiters circulating with champagne while guests examined the auction catalog and positioned themselves near the pieces they intended to bid on. The crowd was exactly what Rebecca would have expected. Wealthy, sophisticated, accustomed to events where art and money intersected in carefully choreographed displays of cultural refinement. I paused at the entrance, allowing the room to notice my arrival without making it obvious I was seeking attention. The effect was immediate and rippling. conversations pausing mid-sentence as people registered that someone significant had entered their space. The suit did exactly what Alessandro had promised, announcing my presence before I spoke a word. Richard Hartwell. The voice belonged to Jonathan Morrison, chairman of the museum's board, and an old business associate who'd watched my construction company transform Manhattan's skyline over 4 decades. My God, man, you look absolutely magnificent. That suit is extraordinary. Thank you, Jonathan. Alessandro outdid himself. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, noting how the server's eyes lingered on my cufflinks with the appreciation of someone who understood quality when they saw it. I heard about your donation, $250,000 for educational outreach. That's incredibly generous, Richard. The board is absolutely thrilled. Jonathan's smile carried genuine warmth, the expression of someone who'd worked with me long enough to know that my contributions came without strings or expectations of special treatment. Education matters, I replied, though my attention was focused on the entrance where new arrivals were being greeted by museum staff, especially teaching young people to respect the achievements of previous generations. The comment was innocent enough in isolation, but Jonathan caught the undertone that suggested deeper meaning. His eyebrows rose slightly as he processed the implications of what I'd said and how I'd chosen to say it. Is there something specific you're referring to, Richard? You seem different tonight, more focused, if that makes sense. Before I could answer, a ripple of attention moved through the crowd like a wave breaking against shore. Near the entrance, David and Rebecca had arrived, her black Chanel dress exactly as elegant as promised, his tuxedo perfectly tailored and appropriate for the occasion. They moved through the greeting process with practiced social grace, Rebecca's smile bright and engaged as she recognized faces from her professional network. She hadn't seen me yet, but several people near the entrance had noticed me, and the whispered conversations that followed their glances were creating the kind of social pressure that draws attention like a magnet. Rebecca would become aware of my presence soon enough, and when she did, the real evening would begin. Jonathan, I said, finishing my champagne with deliberate slowness, I think you're about to witness something that will make tonight's auction particularly memorable. Richard! Jonathan's voice carried a note of concern that suggested he'd known me long enough to recognize when I was planning something significant. Please tell me you're not about to create a scene that embarrasses the museum or its guests. Quite the contrary, I replied, straightening my jacket with the satisfaction of a man who'd finally decided to stop hiding his light under a bushel. I'm about to demonstrate that some people have been operating under incorrect assumptions about what kinds of scenes are actually embarrassing. Across the room, Rebecca's gaze finally found mine. The expression that crossed her face was complex, starting with recognition, shifting through confusion, and settling into something that might have been fear. She understood immediately that the man she'd been dismissing for 3 years was no longer the same person who'd absorbed her insults with polite silence. The suit had done its work. Now it was time to see what lessons the evening would teach. I walked toward them, with the measured pace of someone who owned every room they entered, the crowd parting slightly as people instinctively made space for someone who commanded that level of attention. David saw me coming, and his face went pale, understanding immediately that whatever he'd feared about this evening was about to become reality. Rebecca, David. I greeted them with the same warmth I'd shown at every previous family gathering, as if nothing had changed except the quality of my tailoring. You both look wonderful this evening. Rebecca's mouth opened slightly, her carefully prepared social responses failing her as she processed the transformation that had occurred since Tuesday evening. The man standing before her bore no resemblance to the figure she'd mocked at David's birthday party. This was someone else entirely, someone whose presence suggested power and influence that extended far beyond anything she'd previously understood. Richard, she managed finally, her voice carrying the strain of someone trying to maintain composure while recalculating everything they thought they knew. That's quite a suit. Thank you, I smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd just played a winning card. I decided it was time to update my wardrobe. Your comments about my fashion sense were so helpful in clarifying what needed to be done. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from an explosion, impossible to ignore and dangerous to touch. Around us, conversations continued, but I could sense the attention of nearby guests, the subtle shift in social dynamics that occurred when people sensed they were witnessing something significant. David stepped forward, his face carrying the expression of someone trying to prevent a disaster he could see approaching but couldn't stop. "Dad, you look incredible. Really impressive. I'm glad you approve, son." I straightened my tie, the gesture drawing attention to accessories that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. "Though I have to admit, your wife's assessment of my previous wardrobe choices provided excellent motivation for making some changes." Rebecca's face had gone completely white, her champagne glass trembling slightly in her hand, as she realized that every word I spoke was being overheard by people whose opinions mattered to her professional and social standing. The art dealers and gallery owners who formed her network were beginning to understand that they were witnessing some kind of family drama that involved sums of money they could barely calculate. "Perhaps," I continued, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet space around us, "we should discuss how much you appreciate authenticity in clothing choices. I believe you mentioned something about preferring vintage pieces that don't try too hard to keep up with current trends." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of quiet that makes elevator rides uncomfortable and dinner parties memorable. Rebecca understood now that she was trapped in a conversation that could destroy her reputation if handled incorrectly, surrounded by witnesses who would remember every word and share the story with their own networks for months to come. But what she didn't understand yet was that this conversation was only the opening move in a much larger game, one where the stakes extended far beyond social embarrassment into territory that would reshape our family dynamics permanently. The real lesson was just beginning. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.